I mean, in my tradition, you have 5 prayer cycles a day as well if you're in the monastery. And the evidence is when people are walking in and out of the session, that's where they solve the problems. So most human traditions have developed mechanisms to bring people together from different backgrounds. If you go to a Catholic church in Southern Ireland, the men stand outside while the women pray. Yeah, they go in for the mass when the bell rings, but actually outside they're sorting out the problems of the village. Yeah, so that's one of the major roles of. If you look at evolutionary psychology, it's basically saying religion is inevitable. You can't be a human being and not be religious in some way or other. Yeah, and one of the reasons is it brings people together from different backgrounds. Yeah, it's one thing which pulls you together so you can have conversations. So you can see in evolutionary reasons as well. Yeah. Any more? And I should make a general point from somebody asked me a question. Part of the problem we got at the moment, not just Europe, but certainly in the Middle East, is the imposition of American culture in management. Yeah, and if you look at what happened back in the 80s, just give a little history lesson. Up to the 80s, we had what was called scientific management, which is much decried, but actually if you go and read Taylor, he was humanizing the workplace. And the decision model, the metaphor of leadership in scientific management was military, because it was the only thing available. Now, military frameworks are actually quite adaptive. Yeah, when you get into war, basically a sergeant has authority over a general in some contexts. What happens in the 80s is systems thinking comes in, principally around systems dynamics, which was Peter Senge and business process re-engineering. So the concept is we can actually engineer a system. Senge says it, the way we handle uncertainty is we define goals and then everybody aligns behind the goals. So the principle here is we want to eliminate uncertainty. We want to give control. And so the metaphor becomes an engineering metaphor. Engineers do not like uncertainty. So they seek to eliminate it, right? Because that's what they're meant to do. But you can't engineer a human system. Something which works in a closed manufacturing system will not work in an open service situation. But that triggers and that's the early days of computing. Again, people forget this. It wasn't until the 80s that computing became scalable. Yeah, so we get the rapid growth of computing, we get the growth of management consultants. Management consultants in the 80s go from a partnership ratio of 1 to 5, which is an apprentice model, to a production model of 1 to 500. So if you look at what happens, and it happens with BPR, with the ARIS toolset, with SAP, with ERP systems, is consultants become large teams of junior people doing largely mechanical tasks. Now, I had the great privilege of teaching leadership with Peter Drucker for several years. And I still remember he said the role of consultants is not to do the work, but to stimulate people to do the work differently. And the trouble is what happened is the consultants came in and did the work. All right? And if you want something which is controllable, then you treat the world as if it was a mechanical plant. So a psychometric test, if anybody's done Myers-Briggs or something like that, which, by the way, is a pseudoscience. I mean, we know it's a pseudoscience, right? Basically, that arises because HR departments now want to classify people. Yeah, this is an engineering problem, so I need to know I need this role and that role. Then we get spreadsheets for pay rises. I still remember when that came in. I had a high-performing team, all right? We were the most profitable business unit in data sciences for 5 years on the run. I didn't have anybody who wasn't a high performer, but HR said my profile was such, at least 80% had to be not high performers. So I had to take on massive projects and recruit people to get my profile right so I could pay the people I needed to pay what I wanted to pay them. So you got into this gaming behavior, which I mentioned earlier, working around it. Yeah? And that was what came in with systems thinking. We're now in that break, that's breaking. The big consultancy models haven't worked, all right? So we're now into an ecological metaphor, which has distributed command. And it's actually closer to a military one. And so we're kind of like going back there in that sense. But I say the real problem we got is we're taking the dominant culture and trying to impose it. And nobody ever succeeded. Sorry, we're Welsh. We grew up next to the English, so we've had centuries of dealing with this nonsense. You never succeed by copying the current dominant culture because they're better at it than you. To quote Alistair McIntyre, you become anxious stutterers in the narrative of your own existence. If you want to see what the English did to the Anglo-Indians in India, that's a great example of it. They make them second-rate English, so they can never be first-rate. The issue for me is how do we become first-rate Saudis? How do we become first-rate Singapores? And that's by thinking differently. And I will say now, and I'll say this repeatedly, the great strength is that we're commutarian cultures, not atomistic cultures. Yeah, and that's a huge division. So atomism comes about in Northern European for the Reformation. So it's the focus on the individual, and it dominates. Yeah, the trouble is if you work on isolated individuals who are selfish, that doesn't work in a constrained world. So commutarian cultures, I think, have the advantage. And if we look at what you guys are doing with ecological stuff, I mean, China are way ahead of the rest of the world at the moment, significantly on global warming and so on. You need to, actually, to quote an American, Lincoln, you need to think anew and act anew. So continuing the dominant pattern in a new age will not work. You've got to find things in your own culture that you can then build on to create something new, and we'll talk a bit about that tomorrow as well. Yeah.
You mentioned that the organization is a complex system.
Yeah.
What can stop this system from evolving, improving themselves? What stops them for 10 or 20 years? IBM examples.
Success. The worst possible thing is success. And I remember writing a report. I was doing consultancy, a strategic consultancy for Kodak. And I wrote a report which says, I've been doing ethnography. You could be the world's leader in digital photography. Yeah, but it will involve revenue sacrifices in the short term. Guess what? They kept with chemicals. I mean, market research is in what we call a Kodak moment at the moment. It's getting more and more expensive to produce fewer and fewer results. Nobody's thinking differently. IBM dominates the world of hardware until hardware becomes a commodity. But then it can't switch because it's so successful in the old paradigm, it can't switch to the new one. Microsoft takes over. Then software becomes a commodity. Microsoft can't succeed in that, so Apple take over. And there's a model on this I may work with tomorrow. It's called Fletcher's curves. The thing which makes you more conservative is being too successful. The more successful you are, the fewer people who are prepared to change for it, the nastier the shock when you come out at the end of it. It's called apex predator theory in biology. Yeah, so if you look in an ecosystem, you get an apex predator. And the apex predator, once established, the rest of the ecosystem organize around them. So they're almost impossible to dislodge until the ecosystem changes. Then they don't survive because they're over-optimized. Yeah. Got it. Now, the key thing here is a principle I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is called De-territorialization. So how do you break a system down so it can recombine in novel ways? I'll make the statement now. A complex system scales by decomposition and recombination, not by imitation and repetition. And if you think about that, that's how DNA works. From 4 basic chemicals, the whole complexity of human life evolves. So one of the key things we'll talk about, we'll give you a technique for this today and tomorrow, is how do you decompose the present to the point where you can recombine what you know to create novelty. Yeah, and we'll talk about several innovation methods. I mean, the other thing on this, which is key, is a thing called exaptation, if anybody knows that in evolutionary biology. Okay, so we now know that all dinosaurs had feathers. If you haven't seen the latest discoveries in China, and the feathers were very colourful. Sorry, I'm a frustrated paleontologist from the 6th form. What they can do with lasers on fossils now is incredible, right? So we know that all dinosaurs had very colourful feathers. Well, the only reason for lots of colourful feathers is sexual display. Then one breed of dinosaur developed skin flaps under its forelimbs so it could better display those feathers. That dinosaur was small and fast running. It was more prey than predator. So it ran very quickly, spread its arms, and it glided. That's how we got flight. So a trait which evolved for one function under conditions of stress exapted for something completely different. Because if dinosaurs threw themselves off cliffs in the hope of evolving feathers before they hit the ground, that wouldn't be a sensible strategy, right? The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved to manipulate muscles in fingers. It then exapts in humans to manage grammar in language. So the huge sophistication of grammar couldn't evolve in a linear way. It's too big a leap. It requires a non-linear repurposing, something which for one function gets repurposed for something different. Fish didn't come out of the ocean with fins. They came out with limbs. We know that from discoveries in plesiosaurs. So limbs developed in the ocean, they're then exapted on the land. Yeah? If you think it's not relevant, in 1945, A Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine realized the significance of a chocolate bar melting in his pocket. So he put a metal box around the magneto, we got microwave ovens. If you look at the history of human innovation, it's hardly ever novel discovery. It's finding novel uses for existing capability. Now, we'll talk about that tomorrow, because how do you map what you know at the right level of granularity so you can rapidly repurpose it when you're faced with conditions of novelty? The most successful innovation is to use something you're good at for something new. The reason IBM dominated the computer industry is because they're the world market leader in punch card control mechanisms for manufacturing and typewriters. So they repurposed that. They already knew how to do it. They got the much early advantage. Yeah, and I can give you lots of other examples. So the exaptation adaptation is a key one. Yeah, and I mean the medical profession know this backwards. Aspirin is an example of exaptation. Now the key thing in medical these days is to spot secondary side effects early, which you don't do with white and blue form reporting because that's too granular. You want to spot very small side effects very early because that's your new drugs. Now again, what we can do with SenseMaker on patient journey is we can capture those weak signals early. Yeah, because if you can spot those really early at scale, you get there. Sorry, I'll be on this. I'll talk about this because I was going to talk about it later. So one of the things we're looking at is anomaly detection. So we're looking at it in the context of things not just like racism and misogyny, but also things like safety and fraud. So fundamentally, nobody will report, whistleblowing doesn't work. Nobody will report a mild attack, nobody will report a racist comment because it's got to be so serious, it's got to be incontrovertible. Nobody will report something which smells wrong in medical equipment. Sorry, I've known medical technicians say it smells wrong. There's something wrong here, but I don't know what it is. You're not going to report that because if it's investigated, you might be wrong. Do you have the story of the boy who cried wolf? Yeah, okay, you don't want to be the person crying wolf when there isn't a wolf. So what we're working on, we worked on this initially with Boeing, we're just releasing this more formally, is if you see something which concerns you, you basically trigger it as a micro-anomaly report, at which point all stuff to do with your identity is stripped away. So nobody can find out who you were. We just keep certain keywords, but we keep the metadata from the triangles. Then we look for a pattern in multiple micro-reports to trigger an alert. To say we got micro-reports coming in which indicate something may be wrong here, go and investigate it. And that came from counterterrorism. Yeah, we got metal fatigue 3 months early in Boeing with that technique. Because the engineers would not report something they considered serious unless it was really serious. We wanted things that they might mind, but we're not looking at individual cases now. We're looking at a pattern in multiple small cases. Okay? Now that is going to be increasingly important in modern hospitals, not just for health provision, but also for detecting anomalies, which may indicate new disease groups. I mean, sorry, I'm going to depress you now, all right? We know that the next major plague is probably going to be bacterial. We've been those of us in Foresight have been monitoring it for about 3 decades. We made the assumption that something nasty is going to thaw out in Siberia. Yeah, and we've already got the early reports of strange deaths. The Ukrainian war is stopping it spreading. Yeah, but there are things thawing out in Siberia to which we have no resistance whatsoever. And bacterial plagues are far more dangerous than viral plagues in humans. And it's just come in when antibiotics don't work at scale anymore because we've overused them. Right? Now, when we hit that, and it is going to hit us, right, hit in my lifetime as well, I think, we're going to have to rapidly repurpose things we're good at to handle something completely new. So part of resilience is to get ready for that, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. How do you map what you know at the right level of granularity so when the crisis hits, you can find things to solve the problem quickly because you won't find them otherwise. And you don't want to rely on accidents. We talk about managing for serendipity. Would serendipity work here? Okay, it's an English word. It comes from a story about the 2 princes of Serendip who were sent on queries. Yeah? They always found something useful, but not what they were sent for. Yeah? So serendipity means to find something accidentally which proves to be more useful than what you were looking for. And serendipity is a key feature of complexity in humans. Yeah? Yeah?
You mentioned paradigm shifts in IBM from hardware to software.
Yeah.
So AI,
Okay, so two things. First of all, the way you know something is reaching the end of its life cycle is when it becomes a commodity. So when everybody is doing something, that's the time to go and look for something new, because you're not going to get any more utility out of it. Interestingly, the consultants sell things at the end of their life cycle. 3 of the big 5 actually teach when you can't sell it to industry anymore because they know it doesn't work, go and sell it to government as industrial best practice. Yeah, and also go and sell it in the Middle East and Asia. I mean, that is actually taught, and you get the worst teams, all right? So we need to treat that differently, all right? So that's one aspect. Sorry, repeat the question?
Yeah, about the paradigm shift.
Yeah, so now the AI issue. Now, the interesting thing about AI is I've been involved in this for 4 decades now. Yeah, I wrote some of the first programs which use genetic algorithms to choose between neural networks. The problem we've got with AI at the moment is everybody's focused on LLMs.
Yes.
So they're only focused on text. And this thing which has come about since computers, the assumption is something isn't knowledge until it's in text form. Now, text is less than 10% of what you know. We always know more than we can say. We can always say more than we can write down. So you're limited in that way. AI is now training itself off its own output. Yeah, because it's crawling the web. A lot of the web data is now AI generated. And if I'm honest, in the last 30 years, nothing much has changed in the algorithms. The difference is the amount of data available for training and the speed of processing. The problem still remains the same. Computers don't make decisions the way that human beings make decisions. Yeah, computers have perfect memory, human beings don't, and so on, right? So the problem we got with AI is where do we use it as a useful tool, and where do we realize its limitations, which is the big program we're working on at the moment. Because the trouble is you can lose capability. So I can smell snow coming, my children can't. Yeah, we can lose capability within 1 or 2 generations very fast if we don't use it. So the human ability we evolved to make decisions without training data sets. AI can't make decisions without training data sets. We could lose that capability very quickly if we don't use it. All right? So an AI is a massive hype. The only people making money out of AI at the moment are the big consultancies, because they're rolling it out like they've rolled out every other management fad. You've got to go AI this, AI that, AI everything. None of them are paying attention to whether you should or shouldn't, because their whole business model is roll out a new magic carpet, yeah, and just say, adopt this, everything will be solved. So realizing the limits is key, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Yeah.
Do you consider it a paradigm shift or emergent factor of the system?
I don't think it's hugely novel. I think it's just we can do things faster and at more scale. So, I mean, LLMs are quite useful, and I'll say now I think DeepSeek is actually better than ChatGPT if people haven't used it. Because what DeepSeek does is it tells you how it's reasoning before it produces the answer. Whereas ChatGPT, so you can sanitize that and double check it. But even then, it's only synthesizing what it knows. Now, the Chinese have done, I don't think they implemented it, but they've got the legal system in place, which is a backlog. They basically said you can't actually use AI unless you publish its training data sets. The Americans have got no such legislation in place, and they couldn't backtrack it because they don't know what their AI has been trained on. Because there's this sort of tech bro thing in the States, which, sorry, I'm going to be rude about this. The trouble is most AI is written by misogynist white males in their early 30s who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty. If you get that, you get it, all right? The reality is very culturally determined. It's a very specific background. And they're all deeply autistic, and they genuinely believe that they can write an algorithm which will replace a human. It's like the concept of the singularity, if you come across that.
Yes.
You know, I was at a conference in the States on this, and somebody said, what do you think about the singularity? Nobody told me Ray Kurzweil was in the front row. And I said, if anybody believes in their singularity, their brain is ossified to the point where for them it may be possible. And I would stand by that. Because to actually, if a computer can exceed a human being in intelligence, we become more computer-like. Yeah, not that the computer has become more human-like. And I say human beings evolved to make decisions collectively, not individually. An awful lot of our processing is in our social structures, which work in ways that we don't fully understand yet. So there's a real problem with AI. So adopt it, use it, it's very powerful. In medical environments, it can be extremely powerful at research. But the fact it works in research where you've got a known defined problem doesn't mean it will work, for example, in patient engagement, where you haven't got a known problem, the problem is open. And it's this problem about starting a closed system, getting results, and assuming a closed system result will work in an open system. Yeah? Okay. Training data sets, by the way, is something I'll come to. The original development of SenseMaker in counterterrorism was to produce epistemically balanced training data sets. Yeah? So one of the things we can do with, we put the whole problem to the whole workforce. That gives us a training data set we can use to train an AI to repeat the process. But we know the training data. Yeah? So if you're using AI, you should absolutely focus on the training data rather than the output. Yeah? If you don't know the training data that the algorithms are being produced for, you've got to be really suspicious. Yeah? And also, you don't know how it's being used to, for example, just to really scare you, AI can now actually be designed so that it writes virus software after it's behind your firewall. Yeah, so I can trigger an algorithm which you've left behind your firewall to write software which will malware and will corrupt your database. Yeah, and if you look at the Chinese have, I think, over 5 million social media hackers at the moment. Russia has over 300,000. UK has about 150. So the change in the information space has become a modern form of dominance. And it's felt so easy to let it in because you just assume it's producing magical results, and one day it doesn't. Yeah, it's kind of like the Trojan horse. And that Trojan horses are not good ideas because everybody gets massacred at the end of it, all right? Yeah. Any more? I can get really depressing if you get me onto Will. Yeah, no, okay, all right. Sorry, I sit on some depressing think tanks. Has anybody watched the movie Civil War yet? The US movie? Oh, go watch it. 15 years ago, we sat on a mountain in Powder Mountain in Utah and produced 3 scenarios about how the US disintegrates. Yeah, that was one of them. They made a film from it. And unfortunately, we had a conference call 2 nights ago. It's actually stepping through exactly as we predicted it. So if you get martial law before the midterms, you know you're going to get civil war. It's worth watching that movie because, as I say, it was based on, that was before we knew about populist presidents. We hypothesized a populist. Yeah. The other one is called the Gilead scenario. If anybody's had The Handmaid's Tale. So what happens is red states become redder and blue states become bluer because Democrats and Republican states leave, so Gilead forms. You get 2 cultures. Yeah. Okay, I did warn you I can get depressive. Right? Okay, any more questions? Right, okay. So let's kind of like move on a bit from where we were. And this is stop projecting, so do I need to do something? Do I need to switch it on? Okay. So remember I talked about an assemblage, yeah? So that's a pattern of stories which, and it's not, the concept of a meme is a bad concept. No geneticist takes Richard Dawkins seriously, which is where the idea comes from, right? So there's not one thing seeking to replicate itself, and the gene doesn't even do that. What you've got is, it's a trope, it's called in narrative. So it's a pattern of stories which are forming and reforming, so it's very difficult for people to escape from them. Remember I talked about that in terms of belief systems? Yeah. I'm still waiting for this to come up. This is where I do need to show you, I can't just describe it. It's making noises. This is helpful. Sorry, I should have checked this before I started lecturing. Yeah, here we are. Okay, so this is an assemblage. Yeah. The quote there is actually from this book, which is now available. This is kind of like a background to it. The Snowden on that is not me. That's my daughter, who's an anthropologist who thinks I don't understand Deleuze and looks after our medical practice, all right? Be wary of educating daughters to a certain level. They threaten to write papers tearing your ideas apart, all right? So this is, remember I said we have 4 triangles, 6 triangles? This is a fitness landscape. It only has a Z dimension, not an XY dimension. So it takes all of the data from all of the input and it does a probability distribution to say what are the underlying patterns. And this is actually a cultural map. So what we've done here, and if you go onto a website and look at QuickSense, you'll find the whole thing worked out with examples, so you can play with it. What we do is we present 6 cartoons to the whole workforce. Cartoons are extremely effective because they're quite savage in their nature. I've got one from Gaping Void on the wall behind me. So it's got a red cross. This is the Christian tradition. And it says, same cross, different nails. And every time I look at that, I think differently about the problem. All right? So that's what good cartoons do. It's called aporetic in Greek. It throws you into a place where you have to think differently. You can't answer a problem by thinking traditionally. You've got to think differently. So cartoons are very good at that. So we pick 6 cartoons drawn by somebody in the culture. Yeah? We don't want American ones in the Middle East and so on. We get people to choose the cartoon which most represents the culture of their company, which makes it more fun. It's not like a survey. Then they tell a story about why. And then they index it onto 6 triangles which come from cultural anthropology. Yeah, so the way you create the labels on the triangles is you go to the field, you identify the concepts, you produce the concepts from that. So there's structure to it. And then after they've indexed that and told a story, which they don't have to do, we can draw these maps. As you can see from that map, this is not a single cultural environment. I've got this sort of green pattern in the middle, which overlaps most of the other cultures, but I've got different cultures. That one is sufficiently different that may be the 17% who see the world differently. We use the same things when we do the sort of mass sensing. Now, once I've got that, I can say, well, actually, that tells me I've got these patterns which are strong, but they don't coincide. Right? Now, that may be good news. It may be bad news. We don't know. But if I want to change it, the way I change it is quite simply, I click on one area of the map and say, how do I create more stories like these? And on the other area of the map, how do I create fewer stories like those? Now that's a statistically valid representation coming bottom up. I can actually now identify change in language that everybody can understand, and it's called micro-nudging. I can then see whether the change has happened. That is a different type of KPI. It's called a vector measure, not an outcome-based target. So outcome-based targets work in a predictable environment. In an unpredictable environment, you measure vectors, and vector measures direction and speed of travel for energy utilization. So are you going at the right direction in the right speed with a reasonable consumption of expenditure or time? Okay? So it's not that we challenge the idea of measurement, but the measurement has to be appropriate to the system. So vector measures work much better in medical environments, particularly in patient care. So we've done a major project in old people's homes in the Netherlands. Old people's homes in the Netherlands are closer to hospitals in some ways. So what we got there is we got the nurse, for example, will take a picture of the patient, let the patient tell a story orally about how they're feeling. The nurse then writes notes. Both the patient and the nurse index the same story group into the same triad set, which means we can trigger an alert to a nurse if she's seeing the world differently from a patient. We can do that in real time. But what I've got is a huge amount of data coming in about feelings and attitudes continuously. It was originally designed to complement the medical system, but it flipped. The medical data started to complement the narrative data, because it was much easier for medical staff to deal with the stories and more like this, fewer like that, than it was to deal with the medical data. And that's a case study you're welcome to look at and so on. So the principle is we want to capture how people feel about things, how they're responding to things, not just the medical data. And as I said earlier, doing this makes people feel they're more human in the process. It gives them agency. My daughter's thesis was actually the anthropology of male diabetes. And she looked at the level of agency people had in who managed to reverse diabetes and who didn't. And if you didn't know it, you can reverse diabetes. Yeah, it's done by starvation. Right? But the point is, she said, people who had agency, who believed in it, were able to do it. People who were doing what the doctors and nurses said just fell into a compliant culture. They had no agency, therefore it was more problematic. Right, now this is going to be really important in modern healthcare, particularly when we're dealing with novel forms of disease and so on. And by the way, in mental health, giving people who are mentally ill the right to interpret their own experience can be very powerful. It becomes a therapeutic device in its own right. Yeah, because there's structure in being able to see it. Yeah? And finding other examples. So that's kind of like an assemblage. Right? Let's say the patterns can be very strong, they'd be difficult to escape. Okay, something else on this which you might want to have a look at. These are called sacred storybooks. We're producing quite a few of these. These are two examples. The one there is from the pandemic stories in the Welsh Valleys. That's publicly available, anybody can get it. The other one we've just done for BMW, I'm not allowed to show you anything other than the front cover. So what we've done is we've captured the identity stories of the company or the culture. Now, the way you do this, by the way, in a country, and we're now working at scale on this in other countries, is you ask children to go to their grandparents and ask the grandparent to tell them the story of their childhood that they think the other grandchild should remember. So I'll give you my example. If you ask me for my grandmother's story, in the 19th century, the English decided that Welsh was an uncivilizing influence on the Welsh and had to be abolished. They passed an act of parliament to eliminate Welsh. The English have been trying to civilize people around the world for centuries, and we really wish they'd stop, all right? So if my grandmother spoke Welsh in school, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck, and written on it was WN for Welsh not. She then had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she handed over the knot. And whoever wore the knot at the end of the day was thrashed by the teacher. Yeah? Everybody in Wales can tell you that story. Nobody in England believes it happened until you prove it to them. But it's part of Welsh identity. We know that happened. All right? And I think finding out those stories are key because they inform it and they skip 2 or 3 generations. So those are called sacred stories. So finding the stories that people remember when they first joined the company. Because when somebody joins a company, they're told the founder stories, the creation stories. Yeah, mapping these, by the way, gives you much faster induction than anything else. Because people aren't inducted by formal training, they're inducted by being told the stories. And of course, you don't get told the stories unless people like you. Yeah? So we capture those stories. And we publish them in books like this, which basically have the stories, and they're selected algorithmically, not by experts. So we capture all the stories which are indexed as everybody should remember this and this profoundly influenced me. We just capture those regardless, put them in a book with illustrations, and say these are the sacred storybooks of the company or the country. Now those actually induce people much faster because they will spend time reading those stories. We can make it online as well, whereas they want something more structured. Yeah? Sacred stories, which we're now starting to work. We did a big project on stress with the Royal College of Nursing in the UK, which is published. Ellie led that. Which produced some profound studies. That's completely replicable, by the way. Nurse stress is a major factor at the moment. But what we want to do next on that is to produce the good and the bad stories about nursing into sacred storybooks that new nurses can be given, or people who want to be nurses can actually buy. Because you can romanticize this stuff. Yeah? And we had this at school. So I say my father was a veterinary surgeon. And then this program came out on the BBC called All Creatures Great and Small. Okay, it romanticized veterinary surgery. It was full of wonderful vets curing sick animals by staying up till 5 o'clock in the morning and curing them. My father used to look at it furious, yeah? And so we used to take this induction program for people who wanted to become a vet. And we'd end up in a cow shed and, the calf's ill, all right? We're going to stay up all night curing it. Dad would take out the bolt-action shotgun and kill it. Because that's what vets do. It's not economic to keep the animal alive, all right? So it was de-romanticizing that. So sacred storybooks can actually assimilate people much faster. They can understand things. That was one of the ones we did with the first time I killed somebody's stories. So actually creating physical artifacts which carry stories is more important than actually structured documents, and people read them more. With the American military, I used to, before COVID, to teach just war theory at West Point. Sorry, the only those of us who understand just war theory are those of us who are Catholic Marxists in the 70s, because we had to go back to Aquinas to justify killing people come the revolution. Sorry, this is my childhood, all So I now teach just war theory at West Point, which is quite scary because they read the textbooks you set them. I'm not used to students doing that. Gives the students an unfair advantage if they actually do the reading in advance, right? But we taught just war theory. I noticed a huge amount of stress. So when we deployed into Afghanistan, we said to company commanders, if you keep your stories up to date in a field journal, you don't have to write a patrol report. Everybody did it. Nobody wants to write a patrol report, because if you don't know, in Afghanistan, they were doing 12-hour patrols, carrying weights, which means they'll have to have knee replacement operations in their 30s. Yeah, so it's hugely stressful, it's very threatening. So that actually reduced the stress, but it meant we had real-time human data coming in from multiple human agents that we could combine with the traditional data, which actually gave us better ways, for example, anticipating improvised explosive devices. Because I've now got the sort of training data sets I need to use AI to watch for similar patterns. Right? But I've also got company commanders wanting to look at other stories like theirs. They didn't want to look at doctrine. That's what we're now doing in medical environments. If you get people to continuously capture narrative rather than write reports, you've got much better data because it's not subject to change and memory, and it's coming in real time so you can see patterns early. So in Sloan Kettering, for example, in the cancer hospital, we focused on identifying depression clusters. Because if people are in a chemotherapy ward and somebody gets depressed, they can take everybody else down with them. So we could spot that early and move them out before they took other people down. And that's another example of weak signal detection. I'm trying to give you lots of examples. Yeah, I mean, once you break the thing down, it's much easier to do lots of novel things with it. Okay? So that's kind of like a key aspect of this. And that leads me on to this beastie. Now, sorry about this. I would normally hand draw this, but I've got the iPencil working, so I've got to change the tip when I get back. You're all familiar with the blue curve. Yeah? That's called a bell curve. All God's children love bell curves. Right? Because we can eliminate the outliers. Right? The trouble is, if I do a double log scale of size against frequency of virtually any natural phenomena, then I get a pattern which looks like that. So there are a lot of small earthquakes, a small number of large earthquakes, a lot of small disease outbreaks, a small number of large disease outbreaks, and so on. Yeah? Now, I can draw a straight line through that. I'm hoping the build works. Yeah. That's called a power law. This is Taleb's work, it's Didier's work. Yeah, basically, that's a power law. It doesn't fit at the top, and that's significant. Now, if I overlay that on this, I get the red curve. This is a Pareto distribution. That's a type of Gaussian distribution. So if I just change the distribution structure, I've now got a fat tail. So the things I eliminated as being very unlikely now turn out to be more likely than I thought. And this is the big problem with safety. People study the past, they believe what people tell them, which is a mistake, because if you failed, you're going to tell the story differently than if you succeeded. And then they assume events follow a normal distribution, and within the center of those distributions, you can construct rules. Yeah? So what that means is that if I go into this space here, oh no, sorry. Right, okay, I'll have to describe it. So in the central space on that, where the two curves overlap, nothing is going to happen in the future which hasn't already happened the same way in the past. I've got a many-to-many relationship that in complexity terms is basically an ordered system. I've got predictability. So there I can create rules. Nothing wrong with that. I'm dealing with anything which is probable, and I can assess the probabilities. If I move out into the blue area, sorry, the grey area, now I've still got repetition between past and future, but increasingly I get immutation and novelty. So now I'd have to deal with anything which is possible rather than anything which is probable. Right? Now I can still use the past to make statements about the future, but I have to do things like scenario planning, cone of possibility, risk matrices, futures cone, all of those sort of things fit in this space. They don't work outside it. Scenario planning only works in this domain. It doesn't work when I go to the far right. Because when I move to the far right, nothing is happening quite the same way twice. Yeah? And so I'm having to deal with anything which is plausible, not just possible. And of course, from going from probable to possible to plausible is an exponential curve up. Remember the dots and how many dots there are? The things I have to account for now are infinite, yeah? Or near infinite. Now that requires us to think differently. Yeah? So what's interesting is the process of dealing with the things which are under the domains or almost under the domains is called inductive thinking. So if I look at logic, we have deduction, induction, abduction. Deduction, if A then B. Induction, all the cases of A have B, so I can assume some linkage. You have to be careful, correlation, causation, remember, but I can assume some linkage. That's how computers think. What's my training data? What's the probability of something similar? Human beings evolved to manage the extreme, and that's called abduction. It's a great contribution of the American pragmatists to philosophy. Abduction is known as you have to identify or take seriously any plausible connection which exists. So this is about hypothesis generation, not hypothesis testing. And if you jump into hypothesis testing, the hypothesis is just going to be based on conventional wisdom and not going to be broad enough. Yeah? So plausibilities is key. Now the problem of abduction is I have an intuitive insight. We all have insights. How do I, as a decision maker, make up my mind between your intuitive insight and your intuitive insight? Who's right? And that's the problem we were set by Poindexter when I started to work on counterterrorism. Yeah? Because the problem is you're always being told things that you should pay attention to. How do you pay attention to the real things? And that's where we created this concept of presenting the problem to the entire workforce, getting them to index it and seeing the patterns in the interpretation. And that's one of the ways you handle the problem of abduction. I'll send you some papers on this which describe it in more detailed fashion. But it's also where continuous scanning matters. So if I've got people making observations in a medical faculty on a continuous basis, I'm going to see weak signals, minor deviations very quickly because it's quant, not qual. I can look at them in aggregation. And the key thing on, for example, disease prevention is often seeing a connection between something which happened 3 years ago and something which has happened now, which you won't find with conventional research. So that's called abductive thinking. And all of our tools are designed to facilitate abduction, of determining which aspects of intuitive insights you should pay attention to and how you limit risk on that side. And I'm going to go through more methods on that as we go downstream. But that's the sort of basic principle, yeah, of what we're trying to do here. So, I've gone round the houses a bit on this. I now want to kind of summarize a lot of this, all right? And then give you a chance to have another conversation and come back with questions. So I'm going to go through a lot of this again tomorrow. So I'll introduce the Cynefin framework to explain complexity more. For the moment, I've just done complexity. I'm going to build on entangled trios maybe this afternoon to talk about distributed resource allocation. We'll see how much time we've got. But I just want to summarize the principles as to how you manage in a complex space. Right? So you can't have objectives. You're dealing with inherent uncertainty. So there are basically principles. Now, this is actually one of the areas I used AI to great effect. Because I had 8 factors that I needed to do, and you have to create an acronym so people can remember it. So I said, these are 8 letters, create a word from it. Now, because ChatGPT wants to please me, it created words which didn't exist and said they did. But never mind, all right? You know, my vocabulary is enough, I knew it was lying to me, all right? So I said, you can drop 1 letter, at which point it came up with pagoda. And the letter it dropped was F, which stands for fractal. And of course, a pagoda is fractal in structure. It's self-similar at different levels. So that was kind of like serendipity. That kind of like worked, all right? I use AI a lot, right? It's really good for composing satirical limericks for battles with idiots on LinkedIn, all right? I've had The Ancient Mariner adapted several times. It's actually really good at that sort of stuff, all right? If you treat it as a game, all right? So I don't often have fights on LinkedIn, but you know, when I do, I want them to be, yes, I know, people know me, all right? So what I want to do is to run through those, because this is a quick memory device. So fractal is one, all right? Now, I'll show you this tomorrow when I show you the Boeing case study. If I want to change safety culture, I want to look at the data at the level of my ability to act. So what we did is we presented those landscape maps I showed you to Boeing board for the whole of Boeing. And they said, how do we create more like this, fewer like that? And they came up with the idea, if 3 engineers from different backgrounds agree, they can break rules. Each factory had their own map. drawn from the same source data, but they only saw the map for their factory. And of course, everybody was in a different starting position. And then each work group, and that's called fractal. Yeah, so I don't try and do a project over the whole company or the whole country. I basically gather the data, then I present the data to people at their level of competence to make a decision and difference. So everybody is starting from where they're actually starting rather than an average of the whole company. And that, by the way, is a huge switch in organizational development. It's a massive switch, all right? Because organizational development nearly always starts top down based on a goal and tries to make people conform. Complexity says, where are people? What can we do next? Yeah? And that's called the adjacent possible in complexity. Is there somewhere we can step to and look again? Anybody seen the movie Frozen 2? Okay, I call this the Frozen 2 strategy. It's a great complexity movie, it's Frozen 2, all right? Because it was written for adults as well as for children. I mean, you know, good children's stories are always written for both, all right? Pug watched The Pirate when I was young, but I won't repeat that in civilized country. Adults had hysterics. Children didn't know what the language meant, all right? Roger the Cabin Boy means something very different to adults in English than it does to children, right? So either way, so in the middle of Frozen 2, when the heroine of the movie, who's the younger sister without the magic, remember, the heroes and heroines are always more like us. They're not the magical figures, yeah? She's lost the snowman, she's lost the sister, and she's in a pit, and she sings this beautiful song, all I can do is do the next right thing. And that's complexity. I do the next right thing, I look again. I do the next right thing, I look again. I move forward through a series of nudges, which means I'm open to possibilities and I don't make major mistakes. If I try and leap to a perfect future state, well, it's trying to leap a stream when you've got stepping stones available to you. Yeah, you may make it if you're super fit, but most of the time it's a disaster. Okay? So that's that kind of like principle. So the first one, that's the fractality. Next one, P, stands for proximity. Proximity matters. The human race responded quite well to COVID, but it's not responding very well to climate change. Proximate threat we can deal with, distant threat we can't. Right? And that's what we are as a species. Trying to pretend we should be something different is a waste of time. We have a major project at the moment where we're trying to find examples of minor community-based sacrifice for the sake of ecological health. Because until the small sacrifices mount to a significant level, governments won't change on the big sacrifices. Yeah, because the attitudes won't matter. No? So that's a key principle. Democracy probably can't survive global warming. It's no coincidence China is doing better than the West and so on, and you guys are doing West as well. You know, you can't have major long-term decisions made when politicians are elected on a 4-year cycle. It doesn't work. Yeah? Not to say it's not right for other purposes, but sorry, it doesn't work in the face of existential threat. Yeah? Which is not to justify autocracy or random autocracy, which we've got in the States at the moment. Right? So basically, proximity matters. If you put things close to each other, they will influence each other. If they're far apart, they won't. Remember my example of peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland? We put people from very different backgrounds together in close proximity, working on something they already agreed was a common problem, so they would understand each other better. The trios exercise you did, that increases proximity between people who wouldn't normally talk in a focused project-based environment. Coming back to my macro themes, if human beings are going to actually work together, they have to have a project. It's not just a matter of talking about being nice to each other. That doesn't work. Yeah, working together does. Right? So that's kind of like a change mechanism. So that's proximity. Yeah? We then get what I've talked about before, which is anomalies. So remember, it's only when, if you consistently, your autonomic response is consistently wrong, do you realize you have to think about it actively. So human cognition, the use of your brain as opposed to your body, your social environment, your habits, only flicks in when there's an anomaly, which is less than 10% of the time. Another reason not to talk about mental models, because that's not the way it's working. All right? So I have to create anomalies. Another example we can do with SenseMaker. So we can present, we're about to do this at scale, so we present a problem to the whole workforce. We get them to identify and index it, and then we show the executives the difference between their perception and the perception of their workforce. You say, you all went through the same process, your pattern looks like this, your workforce pattern looks like that. What does that difference mean? Maybe that explains why people won't listen to you, because they see the world differently. Yeah, because they went through the same process, yeah, they can't challenge the results, and that creates an anomaly, so they think differently. Yeah, so creating anomalies is really important, because that's how you achieve change. Yeah, the anomaly of a Catholic working with a Protestant and realised they had a lot in common, that made them think differently about their relationship. Yeah, big scale and small scale. Yeah. So that's anomalies. Then we can go on to G. This is probably the thing I mentioned several times now, but it's key, is granularity. Granularity matters. Fine-grained things can combine and recombine very quickly. Coarse-grained things can't. Remember I talked about recipes and chefs? Well, if you want to play with them later, what we've been doing is to move all of our methods and tools onto hexagon-shaped notes. There's a virtual version as well. The reason for hexagons, by the way, if you want to understand this, go onto the internet and type hexagons are the bestigons. It's a brilliant little video which shows you why hexagon shapes works much better than squares or circles. So what we've done is we've taken every aspect of our methods and tools and reduced them to their lowest level of coherent granularity. Yeah? And we've created a card for that. On the back of the card is a QR code which takes you to the wiki for detailed description. What that allows me to do is to put together methods and tools in different combinations, like a chef does, rather than always follow the same structure. And this is now open source, so other people are contributing to it. So granularity matters. Small things will recombine. Lots of small groups working on a problem will generate lots of novel solutions, then you recombine the solutions. Having one group focused on it as a special task will not produce novelty, it will produce a politically correct solution. Yeah, tiger teams don't work because the tiger teams are aware of who their sponsor is. And they don't want to tell their sponsor something they don't want to know. Give another example is when I was working for John Poindexter, and remember he was National Security Advisor, which is the most powerful position in the US government. He said every time he asked for advice, the agency competed to tell him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to hear. Now I've checked that out with other NSAs and senior executives. The more powerful you are, the more people don't want to tell you things you don't want to know. So you get immunized from them, and eventually the failure is catastrophic. What we're doing with things like mass sense is called disintermediation, which I'll come to in a minute, is we're allowing people to see the raw data without interpretation. Yeah, which changes the game on advice. Right? But that concept there of granularity is key. Given a problem, you break it down until it can recombine. So the exercise we'll do tomorrow, which is mapping the current state of affairs, we don't allow any disagreement. If people disagree, they break things down until they agree. We don't want to compromise. We don't want power to influence. We want to have something which is absolutely based on everybody's agreement. And you can achieve that by breaking things down. Now that's called De-territorialization. Remember I talked about the assembly structures? What we're doing is we're breaking them down and allowing them to recombine. Yeah, so that's the way we change attitudes. You don't change attitudes by telling people it's wrong or telling them what attitude you want. You change it by breaking it down and creating recombinations and seeing which recombinations people are attracted to. Yeah, so again, that's a different way of achieving change. So that's granularity. We then get the one I mentioned several times, which is obliquity. Never approach a problem directly, always approach it indirectly. Anybody with teenage children knows this already. Tackling a problem directly is a fundamental error. It produces massive unintended consequences and major conflict. Yeah, in all societies, no matter what level of religious acceptance you've got. Yeah, what you actually do when you learn children is you always deal with problems indirectly. I found that offering my daughter a tour of North Canada, meeting anthropologists with father paying the bills, was more attractive than doing something I definitely didn't want her to do. But I didn't tell her she couldn't do that. I created a more attractive alternative, all right? Yeah, there's enough grins that everybody's realized that. Yeah? The secret is to wait a bit before you offer the option. Yeah? The same is true of employees. Yeah, getting people to work together on one problem means they'll find solutions to another problem and so on. Yeah, so obliquity is key. Yeah? So that's kind of like that one. Then that leads us on to D, disintermediation. That's the point I made about Poindexter. The more interpretive layers you have between the raw data and the decision maker, the more you filter out things the decision maker may want to pay attention to. So that's why we moved in things like mass sense. So I can have, first major project we did with the British Foreign Office in Pakistan. So it was a project which interestingly proved that terrorism was going from England to Pakistan, not the other way around, which upset the Foreign Office but really pleased the Home Office. The trouble is the Foreign Office had funded it, all right? We used children, we gathered 50,000 stories across Pakistan in a week. And from that you could see the patterns. Yeah? But basically a decision maker could go from a statistical pattern to the raw stories without anybody interpreting it. And that was actually quite fascinating. If anybody wants, I'll happily tell some of the stories on that. There was an absolute belief. It shook a lot of prejudices in the UK about religion. So there was a fundamental belief. I'll tell you the story. Right? We actually presented 6 pictures. Because one of the projects we were testing about whether there was an imperial hangover. So was the problem English imperialism causing the problem? So we had one thing. We had a picture of an elephant being written by an English sahib with Indian servants. Yeah. We had a picture of an emaciated white Vogue model smoking a cigarette. Yeah. We had some black people in chains with white people looking after them. You can see what we're doing here. And we asked what most resonated and tell a story. Now the fascinating thing is the stories were interesting. So it was, man's gone for a ride on an elephant, I'd like to go for a ride on an elephant too. And the most popular picture was the emaciated Vogue model. And people said, pretty young girl has escaped from the village. Yeah, now that wasn't what anybody expected, right? I make no comments on whether it was right or wrong, but that was what the bottom-up aggregated feel was. It wasn't how people saw it, because they were interpreting village life in Pakistan through the eyes of their particularly ideological construct, and the evidence was supporting it. We also showed pretty conclusively that English interventions to improve the lives of women in Pakistan had had the opposite effect, even though the formal assessment said they'd worked, because people knew how to game the formal assessments. So anybody know about the Barbara Bush roundabout problem? Oh, this is fun, right? This is development sector. So do you have roundabouts in Saudi Arabia? Not traffic roundabouts, children's play roundabouts. So they're a wooden structure on a spindle, and children jump on it and push it round at speed. So those are called roundabouts in the UK. So Barbara Bush sponsored an initiative by which they would put roundabouts in African villages, which would also act as pumps. So the idea is you put a roundabout into the village, the children would play on the roundabout, that would pump up fresh water. Massive project, right? They didn't understand the culture. Yeah, for a start, if children have got that much energy in Central Africa, they'll be doing something in the field, not playing. Secondly, the women regarded the village pump as the area where they sorted out the problems caused by the males in the village, so they didn't want to get rid of that. But they also wanted the money from the development sector. So they have a warehouse in Ghana where they keep the pumps. And when the inspectors come, they move the pumps into the village, and the children are trained to play on them so they can get carried on money. I could give you lots of examples from the development sector, yeah? Because outcome-based targets produce perverse incentives to behavior. Yeah? Understanding where people are is critical, even if it's not where you think they should be. And that's a real problem, yeah? Is people have views on it. So disintermediation is key. Yeah? And again, that's what we do with SenseMaker. Yeah.
It's really difficult from the leadership
Absolutely.
to acknowledge that and understand it and really start acting.
And that's where the stories come in, because the key thing is to put the executives through the same process you put the employees. So I had this once. We did this in Denmark. And I knew it was going to be a bad project because I met the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. He said, "You're really going to enjoy this project." And that made me worried. He said, because I'm an inspirational leader, my staff love me, at which point you're like, oh my God, all right, got a nightmare coming, all right? I mean, that's the level of self-delusion which some leaders had. So we collected stories in China, in Denmark, and the UK. And we produced archetypal characters. It's the way you can represent narrative. So all story traditions have archetypal characters. Yeah, and everybody gets familiar with those characters, so we can produce them from a culture. So I'd end up on this island in the middle of Copenhagen harbour in January. There's only 2 ferries a day, which was a mistake. And you can't swim in Copenhagen harbour in January, all right? You die of we freeze to death with an instant. So we're in there, and we've got all of the archetypes of their employees, and they're represented by cartoon characters, like the ignored employee, the oppressed employee, the tyrannical manager. I mean, they're pretty bloody negative, if I'm honest about it. We didn't let them see it. We took the executives through the same process we'd taken their staff through and produced their archetypes. We had the cartoonists from Borsen, which is the Danish financial newspaper, draw them, right? And they had the inspirational leader, the cooperative employee, the difficult employee, the coaching leader. I mean, it was just such a contrast. And we sent them into a room and said, there's your archetypes, there's theirs. Yeah, next minute, I'm picked up by this massive Dane, right? I was 35 kilograms heavier at the time as well, and slammed against the wall. Yeah, and he screams at me, how dare you say our staff think like that? Yeah, so I'm hanging, by my coat lapels against the wall with somebody with a genetic history of rape and pillage against the Celts, all right? Well, they have, they're Vikings, all right? And I stuttered, I said, that process we took you through, did we influence you? He said, no, because you spoke in English, we spoke in Danish. I said, that's what we did with your staff. And then he got it, which point it got really painful because I got dropped without warning. Yeah. And they went back into the room and talked for 3 hours because they'd both been through the same process. So they couldn't challenge the results. It wasn't an expert telling them. It's we went through the process, they went through the process, they produced this, we produced this. We've got to take it seriously. Yeah, so that use of narrative with statistics is critical. Because if I say we got stories from your whole workforce and it looks like this, nobody can challenge that really. If I say we've interviewed a statistically representative sample of your staff and done a survey, well, executives now have to commission that stuff to get the result they want anyway. So they're not going to believe you. Yeah? And that comes in with several of those principles. Yeah? So disintermediation is key. And then the final one is the one I just mentioned, which is abduction. Is you need to create an environment where people will see completely novel connections between things rather than going with the flow. Yeah? If you want to innovate, you've got to put people from very different backgrounds. Remember I said, a person who's just joined the company with somebody about to retire? You can do it with different combinations of people. Yeah? So one of the ones I did in Westpac, that's a big Australian bank, is, and this is a variation of the thing I talked about with you earlier, which is the entangled trios question, right? So I'll give this case, then give you a coffee break, and then we'll come back, right? So this was an outsourcing deal. Has Saudi Arabia suffered from outsourcing? Okay, it's where a large company like IBM comes along and says, we'll take over your entire computing, we'll deliver your existing service for less money, and we'll add value because we're a big company. So that was the proposition, right? I've been a poacher and a gamekeeper on this one. Right? Now, the trouble is that those nice consultants who sold you the deal aren't the guys who implement it. The guys who implement it are pretty savage project managers because they've got to strip out costs fast. So they generally don't add value. And then they panic at the end of the year because they're going to be measured on did they add value or not. So that was when people like me got called in. Now, we called it performing SEAL time. Yeah, we were expected to come in and balance balls on our nose for the entertainment of people and go away afterwards. So nobody really wanted us to implement ideas. They wanted to, come in, run a seminar for senior staff, get senior staff excited about what it's like to work for IBM, but then please go away and don't bother with me anymore. Yeah. Either way, this one we won a deal, right? So IBM had taken over Westpac, which meant it had taken over all of their IT staff. So now we had a new IBM company, which was 2/3 Westpac, 1/3 IBM, different cultures. And nobody had delivered any added value since the takeover because everybody was focused on cost reduction. And Westpac had started to realize just what their IT staff used to do for free, which isn't in the service level agreement, which they were now being charged extra for. All right? So it's how we say it was a bad relationship. So what we did is we created variation on entangled trios, but in this case, we give a reward for people who self-assemble in teams. So the reward was very simple. It was if you can self-assemble in a team of 5 people and you can deliver $1 million of added value benefit, no, $20 million of added value benefit to Westpac, your entire team will get 6 months sabbatical to work together. All right, now that is a prize to die for in the consultancy community because it takes you out of the utilization trap. $20 million is big enough to be significant but small enough to be achievable in the bank. I do a lesser number in the pharma company, for example. And we had rules about team formation. So you have to have 2/3 from one organisation, 1 from another. At least one person must have only joined the company in the last 6 months. I threw that in at random, but it worked really well because it meant young people were absorbed very quickly and they asked naive questions. One person in your group has got to have a degree in philosophy, anthropology, or psychology. I checked the HR database before I did it, all right? So you see what I'm doing? I'm forcing diversity into a small group. And I incentivize people because everybody wanted to get the team together and achieve that result. Either way, 5 teams got it. Yeah, hundreds of teams almost got it, but the client got the value, so we gave them a lesser reward. But if you think about it, $20 million of benefit for 5 times 6 months of cost, that's a really good return. And I'm creating synthesis and integration. So that's another example of a project. You see, all of these things are changing the way people connect bottom up. So they become visible to the top, and you can see what's sustainable and what isn't. And that's a way of solving intractable problems. Yeah? Okay, so pagoda is a reminder. It's easy to remember, all right? Well, it's certainly easy to remember in English. I'm not going to attempt to do it in Arabic, all right? You can create your own acronyms, all right? And I'm sure, do acronyms work in Arabic anyway? Yeah, they're very common in English. Yeah? They're almost universal in English, yeah? But less so. Yeah? So that's the principle, right? Okay, I just want to make one general point in summary, which is on the slide behind me, and then develop into a variation of the entangled trios and the social network thing, which we'll build for tomorrow, right? So one of the key points to make about complexity science, too many people use it as an excuse. They say everything is uncertain, everything is emergent, so we just give up and hope it works, all right? That's not a good approach, right? You wouldn't do it in your families, why would you do it in society? It's worth looking at the origin of the word manage in English. Right? It actually comes from an Italian word, which I can never pronounce, menagore, which is the ability to ride a horse. It then gets corrupted by the French. Yeah, many things have been corrupted by the French, not as many as by the English, but many, to mean household management. Now, both of them are types of management. So the picture on there is a Neolithic hill carving 12 miles north of where I live. It's called the White Horse of Uffington. It's been maintained for 9,000 years. Remember I talked about monument building to keep people together? That's an example of it. But to me, it really captures the essence of a horse. It's not a literal representation, but it's just flow. It's just beautiful. When you think that that was done by people with antler bones on the side of a hill where they couldn't even see it properly, it's quite impressive, right? The thing below it is called Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management. This was given by my grandfather to my mother. It was his wife's, he was a mean bugger, right? It was the school prize she got for sewing when she was at school, yeah? It is a book which defines everything the lower middle class housewife in Britain needs to know. How many servants you can employ, what you should pay them, how you should discipline them, yeah? How you deal with household illnesses, how you deal with children's education. You can see how thick it is, right? It has lots of recipes, all of which start with take, the yolk of 6 eggs and 5 pints of pure milk, all right, of cream. So the recipes are, shall we say, Victorian and assume large amounts of exercise, all right? There is absolutely nothing in it that isn't defined up front that you can read. It's fascinating to read it. I pick it up every now and then, just go to something and think, oh my God, did they really believe that, all right? That's the difference. Are you riding a horse or are you following rules? Yeah, if you're riding a horse, it takes experience as much as it takes rules. Some things you just need to know, right? And so management of complexity is kind of like riding horses. Management of order is like managing a budget. Menage or manage, if you want to put it simply, right? So that's kind of like a reminder. Now, to develop next, remember we talked about entangled trios, right? And we talked about goal-based stuff where we gave people a prize if they could assemble in a certain combination and achieve a goal. Okay, well, we've now been further refining that because one of the problems we know in society, whether it's medical, non-medical, one of the things we know in the development community is the people who are good at applying for grants probably shouldn't be given the grants in the first place. You want to find the people who are just doing good work who should be rewarded. So we know that's the case. We know everybody knows it's a problem. We know if you go to something like the Gates Foundation, 1/3 of any money they give you will be spent on the bureaucracy of the grant. All right? And that's crazy if you think about it, all right, in terms of the way you manipulate it. So what we decided to do, and it's taken years in coming, this has just been launched, let's take that concept if you're assembling groups of 3, 5, or 7, remember the asymmetric groups? And you come in together in roles and you make decisions, they're likely to be better decisions than any individual makes. Right? And we added to that something called the panopticon effect. Yeah, so this is where you introduce an unseen observer. So you know you're being observed, but you don't know who the observer is. That makes you honest. And it makes this process auditable, which is key. So what we do is we say, if you can assemble these 4 people, or rather people in these 4 roles, and you agree to a 5th role which is completely anonymous, and you agree to record the narrative in the build-up to your decision, the decision and the narrative of the consequences, then you can spend X thousand dollars without applying for a grant. Got the principle? Right? Now what we want to do, so for example, if I've got 50 million to allocate to improving water supply in villages in the Philippines, yeah, it's easy to allocate 50 million, it's very difficult to allocate 50 $500 amounts. But I know 50 $500 amounts might have more impact than the 50 million. So what I do is I basically say, look, I've got this big sum of money, we've allocated this amount of money. If you can assemble these combination of roles, you accept an anonymous role and you accept recording, you can spend $500 on your village. No grant applications, nothing else. And then we see what works, and the real money follows the things which work rather than the people who say they can make things work. So to give you 2 examples on this, the one we're doing in the Philippines, which may eventually get going, is if the head person of the village, the priest, this is a Catholic country, the oldest girl still at school and the youngest boy considered a man. If you can get those 4 people together with an anonymous person, you can spend $500 on your village. Now, the way you get those roles is you run simulation exercises. So the other one we're looking at the moment is end-of-life decisions for children in hospitals, which is not an easy thing to do, right? You know, we're working with Great Ormond Street on this. So basically, somebody comes into a hospital, there's hope that they'll be cured. You then realize that it's a best palliative, not curative. The parents get more and more emotional. The medical staff get more and more medical and scientific and indifferent to handle the stress. They can't communicate with each other. And then it gets really difficult. The legal system gets involved. They had a major case where President Trump in his first manifestation and the Pope got involved. Right? And you really do not want to have that if you're managing a hospital, all right? So what we're about to run is a simulation exercise. We've identified lots of different roles, one of which is a parent who's been through the horror. If you don't know it, one of the things Great Ormond Street have found is if you give your child's organs as an organ donor and you're allowed to have contact with the children who get the organs, that actually improves your mental health. Yeah, which is sort of almost counterintuitive, but it actually has worked very significantly. Because there's a sense of continuity of life in that sort of sense. So we're playing around with effectively a day of simulation to find out which role combination would be the best combination, including anonymity. Yeah? And then those groups are allowed to make the decision. We're looking at it for more general medical decisions because it allows a medical decision can be made without going through formal processes very quickly, but it's made by a role combination, not by an individual, so the stress factor, it goes down and the auditability goes up. So to get the general principle here. Now this is something we're quite excited about because this reduces risk and significantly reduces cost. If you've got a major initiative to improve things, you don't know in advance what will work. And the people who tell you they can make things work will get the money from you by telling you things you want to hear, not things you don't want to hear. So we get rid of all of that constraint and we say very simply, enabling constraints, not governing constraints. Yeah? If you know, these are the roles, if you can get this role combination together and you agree to record what you do at this micro level, you can spend this much money and we won't require you to actually apply for the grant. And then you sit at the centre and you see what works. And that's what we're about to do on healthcare in California. Remember I talked we're going to with schools, social clubs, different people. We're working out what the role combinations are. If you can get these roles together in your local neighbourhood, then you can spend this money on any initiative which you think would improve health. And we'll see what works. And that also allows us to create horizontal flow of ideas. So basically, if you're contributing narrative to a database, you can say any more stories like mine and find stories from other people doing similar work and get ideas from that. So knowledge doesn't have to be mediated through the centre. Okay? Now this, I've finished off with this because I really want you to be thinking about this one overnight. What we're doing is we're changing the substrate. We're doing lots and lots of small things in parallel before we commit significant resource. And we're following things that work, not things that we think might work. Right? That's one of the ways you handle novelty. But I say the real big factor for a senior decision maker is it reduces risk. It's also quite powerful. You can say we trust our people, we trust our population. If you can work together with people you wouldn't normally work together with, then kind of like you can have some money. Yeah? But that reduces risk overall for the system because you're only really investing in things which work. Yeah? So I thought I'd finish off with that because that kind of like makes the point about where this stuff is going, is change the substrate, change the local interactions. Complexity is designed for lazy senior executives. Yeah? Because what you really want to do is to stimulate the system and just sit and watch, and if it starts to work, give it more, and if it doesn't work, give it less. You don't want to be having to make the decisions all the time. And I found that when I was C-level in IBM. 5 groups would come in with well-researched proposals in areas they had expertise and I had none, and I was expected to decide between them. But it's crazy. Yeah? There's got to be a better way of doing things which actually uses networked intelligence. And remember bee swarming, antelope, yeah? All of these things work because they allow hyper-local interactions to produce optimized solutions which can then be amplified. So I only want to scale something which works. I don't want to scale something which people say will work. And I also don't want to do pilot projects. Pilot projects are really dangerous in a complex world. For a thing called Hawthorne effect. Anybody heard of Hawthorne effect? Okay, so this is 1920s, Upper New York State, Hawthorne cable manufacturing facility. So they were studying worker productivity. Right? So they increased lighting levels, people became more productive. These days in the Agile community, they would now publish a book called Light the Secret to Productivity and sell certification courses in how to switch on lights, all right? But then they had some pretension to be real scientists, so they lowered the lighting level and people became more productive. And what they found, which has been validated in many research projects since, if you do something novel for the first time, it nearly always works. But it doesn't scale. Because you're focusing effort on it, it's novel, it's different, people respond to it, but it doesn't scale. So doing small things in parallel, based on contradictory premises, is more likely to really produce what is sustainable rather than what isn't. Yeah? Everybody got that? Okay, now we'll come back to that tomorrow, because what I'm going to show tomorrow is a risk strategy portfolio matrix. It's called Weaving Risk and Strategy Together, which says you can do conventional strategy if you know what the future is. If you've got a limited number of hypotheses, well, you can do safe-to-fail experiments. If you're in an entire world where you're responding to opportunities, well, you need deep sensor networks to spot the opportunities early. But if you really want to reduce risk, you actually do this multiple stimulation to see what's sustainable. So I'll take you through that framework tomorrow. Yeah? Now I want to finish off with kind of like a summary on this. So the thing we wrote during COVID, which I'm really hoping I've got the slide here, is this. So this is the European Union Field Guide on how to manage complexity in a crisis. You can download the PDF for free. They'll send you a free physical copy if you pay for postage. If your country had the sense to stay in the European Union, you won't even have to pay for postage, but that's a personal grief which I'm still recovering with, all right? The Welsh, the Scots and the Irish voted for stay in Europe. The English voted against, right? And by the way, I know the Welsh vote went the other way, but that was English immigrants taking our houses on the North Wales coast, so we still resent that. We used to burn them as a... literally, I mean, just to tell you, there's a massive problem in the UK in that people from cities are buying retirement cottages in rural areas and are driving the local people out, can't afford the houses anymore, so the schools are closing, the shops are closing. So in Wales, there's a phrase, you know, come home to a real fire. People used to set light to the second homes. And there was a sort of deal in society that you would never actually harm a person, and at that point the police would turn a blind eye to the fact you were doing it, because the communities were just deeply suffering from that, right? Unintended consequences of markets, either way. So we produced this, all right? It's a joint publication of the Future Systems Directorate of the European Union and the Kinevin Centre. Yeah? This is actually really good as a credibility statement if you need it, for these adoption. It was actually pushed through quite quickly by the director. He said, if I put this into the normal review cycle, the systems thinkers will be horrified and will modify it to the point where it's useless. So he used COVID to push it through as an emergency publication, all right? That's a good example of a good executive doing the right thing. And what it identifies 5 things you need to do to create a resilient society. Now, let me make the definition of resilience. So, you know about salt marshes because you have salt marshes. Yeah? You do have salt marshes in Saudi Arabia, don't you? You have estuaries? No? Yes, you do. I'm pretty sure you do if you go down towards the Gulf, all right? You've got... Yeah, okay. So not in Riyadh. No, I know you don't in Riyadh, all right? So, sorry, in Wales, in Welsh has 5 different words for estuaries because we have lots of them, all right? And they're very different. And there are male and female estuaries in Welsh as well, yeah? So either way, so the metaphor is very simple. If I create a seawall or a river wall, it's robust, yeah? It means, the waves will beat against it. I can drain the landward side. I can optimize it. I can be very efficient. The trouble is when the design conditions are exceeded and the wall breaks, the result is catastrophic. Yeah. So it's resilient to the point where it fails, and then the failure is catastrophic. Now, we had a seawall break in South Wales, and they decided not to recreate it. They let the sea flood the land on the other side, and that's called a salt marsh. Yeah? Salt marsh lamb, by the way, is one of the great dishes in the world. If you ever come to Wales, get salt marsh lamb, because the herbs that grow in the salt marshes flavour the meat, and it's just wonderful, right? If you want to know where the best salt marsh lamb is, local knowledge is available to you. I can tell you the farm to go to, all right? That's the way it works. Right? So either way, so a salt marsh, the water inundates, and the salt marsh absorbs water, and even when it's full, it doesn't release the water catastrophically, it just overflows. And the salt marsh is constantly shifting and changing based on the patterns of inundation. So that's a resilient system. So a robust system is brilliant and efficient until it breaks, then you wish it wasn't there in the first place. A resilient system is not efficient, but it's very effective, and it can survive failure. Now, in the modern world, we need to focus far more on resilience than we need on robustness. And by the way, Taleb disagrees with me on this. And don't take me into anti-fragile. For me, anti-fragile is a type of resilience. Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, Taleb and I have had a row about that. That was an interesting experience, yeah. But, yeah, because to me, things that get stronger through failure, yes, I agree. But the idea you keep breaking things to see what gets stronger seems to me a fundamental error of judgment, all right? I prefer to create resilience without things having to fail first, if I could. So for me, resilience is a wider concept. Yeah? So there are sort of 5 basic things the field guide talks about on resilience. We haven't really changed this. And this is kind of like what we've been teaching. The first thing is you need to build human sensor networks. So one of the things we've been doing on large public transport infrastructure projects, which generally go wrong in the last few months before implementation, doing this in Australia, is get engineers to actually record their experiences as they go, not to write a project report. Remember I talked about the US Army in Afghanistan? It's that principle. If people write reports, they're always retrospectively coherent. You never, after 1 or 2 hours, you won't remember things accurately anyway. If you have to write a report, you remember things to match the needs of the person who's going to read the report. So by actually moving, this is called the Gemba version of SenseMaker. Yeah, so Gemba is that Japanese concept of walking the floor. So in the Gemba version, engineers continuously capture the data, like I mentioned in the Netherlands Old People's Home, and we don't have reports anymore. Reports are a waste of time. But that gives me constant signals coming in. Yeah? So I can identify previous failures and use that as a training data set to create an algorithm which will tell me when a current project may be about to fail. Because no project manager in living memory has reported weak signals of impending project failure. They always try and solve the problem before they report it. By the time they report it, it's too late. Same is true on safety programs in hospitals and everything else like that. Yeah? So what the continuous capture gives us is that weak signal detection, that ability to see patterns so we can intervene before it becomes a problem. And remember I talked about microanomalies? To record things which concern me, which I don't want to be responsible for, and see patterns. But if I've got that, I've also got a human sensor network. So if a problem comes across my desk, I can ping the whole network and say, this is a situation, what's happening, what do you think will happen next? Get the results back 10 minutes later. Yeah, we'll talk more about this tomorrow. This is kind of like we've now packaged this up to make it easier to use. But the principle is you need to be able to consult a very diverse set of people very quickly when you're facing a crisis, so you can find the people who've seen gorillas. And you can see what's sustainable and what isn't sustainable. So that's called mass quick sense. We're still trying to find a better name for it, but I'll show you something on that tomorrow. Yeah? So building those networks, you notice what I've got is I've built a network to do project reporting, which people find useful, but then I can use it for emergency consultation in a crisis. If I've got every nurse, every doctor, and every patient capturing stories, which we've done in hospitals, I've got a huge sensor network I can ask questions of. So I can interrogate a network and go backwards and forwards very quickly, like the bees swarming, rather than commission research and wait time for the results. So again, that's a way of radically improving efficiency and actually reducing cost. Next one, informal networks. We've talked a lot about that. The single most successful thing you can do, and it's very fast, is build informal networks very quickly, because then that's how knowledge will flow in a crisis or when you get novelty. But it won't happen naturally. So I've given you 3 techniques now, which are variations on that theme. How do you stimulate the system so that people start to work together across silos and build trusted relationships? And by the way, if you're in OD, that becomes a new measure of the HR department's efficiency. It's what's the density of their informal networks. Yeah? You do have a problem on this. I had 2 problems in IBM when I worked there. We identified that informal communities were more powerful than formal communities in knowledge sharing. And they'd use the technology to create private spaces where you could only get admitted if they trusted you. And I told IBM's chief knowledge officer about this, and the response was, well, how do we make them formal? And it was like, you just missed the point, all right? But that was the example of a bureaucracy in play, right? Third one. This is something I'll go through tomorrow, but this is how do you map what we know at the right level of granularity so you can repurpose it. So just give an example now to think about. So we were working with Philips Lighting on innovation. Now, Philips Lighting, they had this belief that if you bought lights as a garden feature, sorry, this is me coming from the UK, all right, where gardens are part of our culture, right? I realise you don't have gardens here in that sense, right? Well, you do, but yeah, in private courtyards with fountains, all right? So I've been in a few of those. So either way, so yeah, lights weren't seen as a garden feature. Now, my annual purgatory is to go to the Chelsea Flower Show. I hate gardeners, yeah, but my wife is a gardener, so if I don't go to the Chelsea Flower Show every year, I'm going to get divorced. I now go as an anthropologist with a telephoto lens because the people are fascinating, and now I'm curious about it, all right? But you'll now see lights are there with stones and flowers as part of garden design. Now, it wasn't the case when we did this project. So we pulled in stories off the web, about 5,000. It was €1 to a tree planting charity if you told a story about, took a picture and told a story about a garden that you thought was desirable. And issues about light and shade, we hit in the triangles. Now, by the way, we did the same thing when we were looking at childhood obesity. We didn't ask people about the causal factors. We hid the possible causal factors in the triads and saw what occurred naturally in people's stories. It's a whole new approach to multivariate analysis, yeah? In the way it works. So we did that. And then we went to everybody in Philips' technical department and got them to interpret all of their technology into the same set of triangles. And the granularity criteria is if you could package and ship it with instructions, that's the right level of granularity. And then we smashed the two databases together at a metadata level, not at a content level. We found 5 clusters where people had indexed technologies the same way people had indexed gardens they liked. We looked at the 5 clusters, and one of them became a new product, which I'm totally ashamed of, but is selling really well in Southeast Asia. It's a plastic rock that changes lurid colours based on warmth, human proximity, and water flow. It is tasteless beyond belief, but it really is selling well. It's entirely based on a technology originally designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in Eindhoven football stadium. That's an example of acceptation. Now, nobody would have thought of that connection if we hadn't shifted things to a metadata structure first. We're now working with one of the California universities about mapping all of their technical knowledge so that we can actually match that knowledge against client problems and suggest that people get together because your technology seems to match this problem. Remember, the history of technology innovation is that it's never used for what it was designed for. It's used for something else instead. So that's called exaptive innovation. I'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. So that says what you do now is you map everything you know so that when you get a crisis, you can very quickly find the things that you could reposition. And that brings in the granularity point again. Next one, highly specialized crews. Now, I've talked a lot about this. I mean, anybody in the medical profession, you work off crews, you don't work off teams. People are trained in role and role expectation. You see that on a flight. Yeah, an aircraft crew is a crew. There's always a pilot. Who the pilot is can change. And by the way, that's a new type of organizational design. You can actually have a leadership crew, and the pilot can change. And if you look at it, really good leaders always take people with them who match their deficiencies. That's what a crew does. It's no coincidence that military is crews, hospitals are crews, civil defense are crews, because being trained in role and role expectation gives the crew a cognitive capacity a team doesn't have, and it can assemble and reassemble very quickly. So creating specialized crews is critical because you have to have hyper-focused functionality. You really don't want generalists in a crisis or in the command center, not in the detailed work. And by the way, the educational system is no longer throwing out generalists. It's a real problem. So when I went to school at the age of 11, all right, we were allowed to wear long trousers at the age of 11, which in a British winter in the 1960s, you did not want to have to walk 3 miles to school in shorts, but we had to do that, all right? Children now mock this, but we did have to do that, all right? And I remember the first day in school, and we separated kids at the age of 11 into grammar school and secondary school. So if you were academic, you went into one school. If you were non-academic, you went into the other. And that had problems, but it did actually mean that Britain was ruled by people from state schools while that was in place. And then when it got lost, they're now back to private schools. Yeah, so the elite was based on meritocracy. So I walk to the front of the class, and I'm given a card, and it says, "You support capital punishment." Yeah? Now, my mother is then leading the Labour Party's campaign against capital punishment in North Wales. So this is the teacher being mischievous. I had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation in favour of something I'd been brought up to disagree with. We did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. And those of us who were good at it were taught rhetoric formally. So I grew up on Cicero from the age of 16. Yeah? Now, what that did is it made us generalists. You didn't know what you were going to get hit with, so you read everything. You also became critical because arguing for things you don't believe in makes you terribly inventive, and you realize what a good argument is and a bad argument. Yeah? And it was a game, so it was learning. Yeah? Now that's a process which generated multiple behaviors. We didn't train people to be critical, we didn't train people to generalist. A very simple game-based process triggered that development. Yeah, and I make that a general point from complexity. Simple processes to generate the behavior you want are more successful than trying to train the behavior. Because behavior is itself an emergent property. Yeah? So that's kind of like a key principle. Right? So I share that because you want specialized crews, but the ability to integrate that is very rare. And a generalist is not a T-shaped generalist. That's a mistake. That's a really bad book. If you're a deep expertise in one serial, that will influence everything you do. Good generalists skim lots of fields. which, by the way, you can always argue with a specialist. I have fun on this because if the specialist hits you and you don't understand the question, you ask them a question about something they've read in a field you know they haven't, and it confuses the hell out of them, so you get strategic advantage, all right? Generalists can do quite well on that, all right? Particularly against statisticians. And then finally, this is what we're going to start on tomorrow, is you need to understand the energy gradients of the present. Now, this is coming from quantum mechanics. In physics, whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. Yeah? So whatever costs the least energy is going to win. There's whole theories of evolution based on this now, which isn't survival of the fittest, which was never true anyway. It's survival of the most energy efficient. One of the reasons humans are so efficient is cooperation reduces the energy cost of survival. Right? And that's one of the points I made earlier. So what we're going to do tomorrow is how do I identify all the actants? Remember the actants concept? What are the actants? What's the energy cost of change and the time to change? Because if the energy cost or the time is too great, I can't change them. So that's harsh realism. Then how do I change, not change things, but change the energy cost if I wanted to change things? So I change the substrate so that I can actually, it's more likely to evolve in ways I want, rather than trying to force it into a situation. So if you want a metaphor for this, there's no point in trying to be the world's leading expert in cactus growing if you live in a paddy field. The affordances do not allow you to do it. You'd first of all have to change the environment so what you want to do is possible. So that's what we're going to focus on tomorrow. What's the environment you're currently in? What is realistically possible? How do you change it so that other things are possible at low energy cost and low risk? And I'll make this final point. Everything I'm teaching you is about reducing cost and reducing risk. That's the way to present it. Reducing cost, reducing risk, by not trying to artificially impose a solution which the system cannot itself sustain. Yeah? We want to stimulate the system to see what's possible. That reduces risk, it reduces cost. Okay, any questions on that? I've managed that almost exactly on time, which is rare. So, yeah.
I have a question about resilience. When we are talking about complex domain and safe-to-fail experiment, what is the level of being resilient with that amount of failure?
I want to address that.
Breaking me, or for example, in my business, losing all of my money, or breaking me to work another project, or what is the...
I think it's fail fast, fail early. Yeah? So let me give you an example in consultancy selling, which I developed for IBM, and I really should have brought across into the company. Right? We would actually work with the client to produce a best and final bid and their requirement spec. And we'd say, we got this lovely process we'll run with you. All the results we'll make available to our competitors. Now, we're now doing that with Mass Sense and SenseMaker. So we'll gather stories from across your whole company and see what's possible and impossible. We want to run that. We'll then bid, but we'll give the results to our competitors so they can use it too. This is actually a very successful strategy because your competitors won't be able to use it because they're not familiar with it, but you're looking like the good guys. What I'm doing there is I'm doing something small to see what's possible before I commit. Yeah? And I'm basically trying to see if I can really work with this client or not, because if the client doesn't want to buy my type of services, I want to find out early. Yeah, so if I offer to do something free, which is going to give them stuff they didn't expect to find, and they say no to that, well, they're probably a late adopter company, not an early majority company, so I need to think about what I offer. Yeah? So that would be an example. But it's do lots of small things in parallel early to see what's possible is massive risk and cost reduction. So take that idea I gave you about allocating money. If I allocate 5 million to 500 grants, I've radically reduced the cost of failure on 50 million. Yeah, and a financial person will understand that. It's kind of like spending a small amount of the money to de-risk the big money, not committing resources till you know something will work. Just makes sense. Yeah. Any more? Okay, so have a think tomorrow, all right? So we try and do this over 2 days anyway because it gives you time to absorb, all right? I say I'm going to go through virtually all the concepts I've gone through today again tomorrow, but in slightly different ways, all right? So it'll give you different perspectives. But what would be useful is, A, think about this, any questions. Think about any examples. So 3 homework questions, just think about it. Secondly, any examples of where things have gone wrong because you didn't understand what was possible first. All right, so those will be useful. And third, any current intractable problems. I don't like the phrase wicked problems. I think that's just management speak, all right? An intractable problem is something that everybody acknowledges a problem, but nobody can get a grip on. So those are generally where you first move with these techniques. You don't go for the low-hanging fruit, you go for the high fruit, because nobody's found a way to get there first, and you may have a way. Yeah? Sorry, that could get torturous as a metaphor, so I won't go too far with it. Okay, all right, yeah.
Last question. When you mention, when you talk about the complexity management, one point you got to go there is not to deal with the complex problem directly. So how can we deal with a complex problem if it's not going to it directly?
By working around it, or going down to a low level of granularity. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the ways to work around it is to get lots and lots of people to work on micro versions of the problem. Yeah, not get a small team to work on the problem. Yeah, one of the most dangerous things you can do in an organization is what's called a tiger team in the States. So the CEO picks a group of people who he thinks will be innovative and puts them onto the project. Well, I guarantee you it will be the wrong people. And yeah, sorry, another story. We did a big project in IBM, all right, on outsourcing deals. So outsourcing deals are binary. One day you've won or you've lost. And you've typically spent $20 to $30 million on the bid. Yeah, bidding for an outsource is very expensive, so your heroes are villains. So we did an interesting study. We went to outsourcing teams and we captured lessons learned the day before they knew whether they'd won or lost the bid. Then we repeated exactly the same process after they knew whether they'd won or lost the bid. And you would think you were dealing with completely different environments. So what they said before they knew the result was ambiguous, it was open. If they'd won the bid, they generally told a hero story in which they made all the right decisions and they were perfect. And if they'd failed, there were 2 options. One is they said, we got that wrong. The other was, we weren't given enough resource, we told you this wouldn't work. What came out of that, which the Americans never accepted, they refused to accept it, the Europeans got it straight away, is any successful team was instantly disbanded and distributed and wasn't allowed to work together again because they'd become complacent. An unsuccessful team which was given excuses were fired. An unsuccessful team which had identified the points of failure were kept together on the next bid, and they always succeeded. Now that was counterintuitive for the US, because the US is a hero culture. If people win, they'll always win, all right? And so that was the way around it. But again, that's an example of trying to deal with those problems indirectly. You start to look at the underlying factors. You change the actants, you change the interactions, you monitor the results. Sometimes you create stability. And just changing down to actants and interactions is working obliquely. Yeah? Because you're seeing what will work. Yep.
So isn't that creating multiple pilots?
Yep.
So you're saying that pilots were not actually a good thing?
Yeah, but multiple pilots in parallel are. That's the point, right? If you do lots of small things in parallel around, the way we do it is we test for coherence. So I'll go through this again tomorrow. You say, anybody got an idea about what we can do to solve this problem? And you get people to clump into groups and propose their solution. And then you test each solution for what's called coherence. So this is philosophy of science. You can't say that something is absolutely true or absolutely false. No scientist would do that. But you can say some ideas are coherent and some ideas are incoherent. So this is a key test in an organization, and the test for coherence is a lower burden of proof. So I can agree that Jules's ideas, for example, on Project X are coherent, but I think she's wrong. But that's okay. If we agree we're coherent, we agree we each run a safe-to-fail experiment. So I reduce conflict, I get smaller things working in faster, but they're called probes, not experiments. Because if you run lots of small probes, they'll change the space, so the solution will become more visible. Yeah? What you don't want is commit all your resources to one pilot. Yeah? I would say that was a good question, but I said that once in Australia, and they told me not to rate their questions, but to answer them. So I just share that with you to use on consultants at some stage in the future, right? Because when you say that's a good question, you're trying to create breathing space to come up with an answer. Right? Yep.
I think many people here may face similar challenges in that the types of examples that you provided today maybe assume that there are enough resources or varying people and capabilities that are available to do multiple probes at the same time or create these multidisciplinary crews or teams as needed, but maybe it's not always the situation in all of our...
It probably always is, because if you're a small company, you live in a network of other companies and suppliers and customers. And nobody lives in isolation, right? And we've done narrative projects where as few as 5 stories have made a difference as opposed to 50,000. Yeah, so this stuff does scale quite successfully, right? I tend to give the examples I've worked on, and I tend to get pulled in on the big projects, not the small projects. Yeah, that's the penalty of being in charge, if you want to put my way, all right? But no, you can work it. So we've done social network stimulation, for example, with small development consultancies of 20 people. But they've created trios in which they've required the other 2 members of the trios, they have to find somebody who don't work for the company. Now, which is actually a really good test of who's networked. So don't think about companies or organizations as discrete, think about them as distributed anyway, and then you can start to apply the techniques. But for example, the S-drive mapping technique I'm going to show you tomorrow, which is the energy gradient, we're now using that for individuals with their coaches. Because I did this with one of the big Latin American banks. So we mapped the energy gradients of attracting high-value clients. And 2 of the executives came back the next day and said, I went through that for myself, and it's really useful. So instead of working with a psychologist, I worked out what are the actants in my environment, what would be the energy cost of changing them. So we're now launching that for coaching, but I'll take you through that tomorrow, and that's working at individual level. Yeah. Any more? Okay, so we'll see you all tomorrow, right? You've got your homework. Don't worry too much if you don't do it. I'll assume you won't, but it would be nice if you did, right? Yeah. Okay.